today's episode, we're speaking with Mr. Antoun Nematalla, or as he's fondly known as Tony Nematalla. So what was it like when you went into Redfern?
Father Mina and his family were the church. They were the servants for the whole church. Dad would make the holy bread. He would celebrate Mass. Ed's in the altar. Albert is outside, the outside deacon. El Ma'allim, the teacher.
Yeah, the head deacon.
The head deacon.
Yeah.
And the congregation on the outside. But people that don't have the uniform, because they weren't ordained as deacons, they would come and stand next to Albert, and one or two young boys would sort of go on the altar just to help out, to get them used to it, because they didn't know anything about the church.
It's like re-educating an entire congregation, isn't it?
Exactly right. Father Mina was a missionary, going into an area where there was no church. People didn't know about a church. They were called Christians. They're Egyptian Christians. But they'd been in Australia for so long that there was no Coptic churches. So he had to educate the whole congregation about the rules and the teachings of the church. He was a patient man, and he was very good at what he did.
And then when Bishop Samuel came, he ordained a whole heap of deacons.
He did, because a lot of people were practicing with us and standing close to us and learning. But that was for the first few months in Redfern. And then when Father Mina bought the first church in Australia, it was at Sydenham. Yes, St. Mary and St. Mina's church in Sydenham.
And that was the first church purchased outside of the Nile.
Yes, and it was the only church, looking back on it, that didn't have a debt. He bought that church from a Methodist organization, and I think he paid something like $35,000. The church only had a few $100s in savings, so he borrowed the whole amount through the Australian Council of Churches. But when we came in the late 60s, the interest rates were unbelievable, to 12, 15%. So he had a very cheap loan at 3%, 2 or 3%, as a loan from the Australian Council of Churches, or International Council of Churches, I can't recall the name, and bought the church. And we started paying, and the repayments was something ridiculous, like $100 a week. To repay that, but we didn't have that loan for long, because the church, Sydenham Church, was on 2 blocks of land. One block had a house, a residence, that Father Mina didn't use, because the church rented, let him stay in the house he rented in Marrickville. So he was traveling from Marrickville to Sydenham for every service, where there's a house right next to the church, or the same block, or adjoining block, and that was rented, and that was helping to pay for the loan. And a few months later, he put a fence up between the house and the church, and he sold the house, paid for the whole loan, and had some money left over. So the church was now operating debt-free.
That's very smart.
Yeah. So he didn't subdivide, but it was on 2 separate blocks. So they sold the house for something like $40,000, or back then that was a lot of money, for $40,000, where people were buying their new houses for $12,000 and $15,000 to sell that house for $40,000, because it was close to the city, and it was a large block of land. So so the church was debt-free. And then they can afford to renovate it, to make it like a traditional church, because it needed the altar where you hang the saints and the apostles and and the Last Supper. You know how you've got a partition between the altar and the church. There was nothing there. There was just a rope and some curtains hanging to separate the altar from the. So they started building up a petition. We built some pews. We started covering the walls, and we made it feel like an Orthodox church.
So the Sydenham Church wasn't actually built, it was renovated.
Yes, it was an existing building. It must have been 100 years old when we bought it.
Yeah. So tell us then about the first church that was built, actually built, purpose-built church.
The first church was built in Australia, that's anywhere in Australia, was in Sydney, and that was built as a result of an accident. Must have been 20 odd years after Father Mina came to Australia, because he would start in the church like he would start in, say, Sydenham, and it would grow. Priests would come in. He would leave him in that church and go and pray in another, like they would rent or buy another church. I think second one was in Kensington, St. George Church. So he would pray there until other priests come in, and then he would move to another church. I think the third church was Guildford.
St. Anthony's.
Yeah, I could be wrong with the order or the timing. But then the congregation, the Western congregation, bought 4 blocks of land. And they had a portable building set, and that's in Mount Druitt, in Methven Street, Mount Druitt. Back then it was a bush. You know, the road was a dirt road, and there were no fences, but they bought 4 blocks. Each block was the old quarter-acre blocks. So the 4 blocks made 1 acre, and an acre is 4,000 odd square meters. Yeah, 4,200 or 4,000.
It's a huge amount of land.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they had the portable building on the first lot. So there were 3 vacant lots. And then one in the middle of the night, Dad had a phone call from the police and the fire. Somebody went in and vandalized the church and set it alight. So luckily the church was insured. I mean, back then I was only in my early 20s, and Father Mina said, okay, we'll need to renovate, so we used the garage, again the portable area, the garage. So we used that until we renovated the church. And when we were renovating, there was a bishop here, South Africa, Bishop Antonius Morcos. He was Bishop of Africa, or South Africa.
Yes.
He was here, and when the church has burned down, and he was saying to Father Mina, why don't you use the insurance money and build a church? Because back then, the church was insured, or that portable building was insured for $60,000. That's for the building, and the contents were insured for $20,000. And the insurance paid out $80,000. So when we heard that suggestion, I was studying engineering. It was, I think, my first or second year of engineering, or could have been a little bit later. And Dad said, Tony, can you draw a church for us so we can get approval and start building? And I said, I suppose I could, because drafting was one of the subjects I did. But I said, I have no idea how to design a church. I know about building or designing a house or drawing a house, but a church? So he got some guidance from Bishop Antonius. And he said, okay, you make it in the shape of a cross or a ship. So I made it the shape of a cross. It was easier back then. So we had some basic plans. I prepared the plans, got some structural details, and within 3 or 4 weeks submitted to council. And Dad used his influence with council, got the approval within a few weeks. So within a month and a half or 2 months, we prepared the plans. We had the approval, and he said, okay, you're doing engineering, can you build it for us? And I said, I've never done it. I'm only second or third year at uni, but I gave it a go, and it started. So I contacted a few excavators. We leveled the land. it was bush. So the church got in trouble for my ignorance for pulling out all the trees. So we pulled all the trees without permission. And council found out and came and tried to find the church, so much per tree. And then Abuna said, look, every tree that was pulled out, we'll plant 2 trees. So we ended up not getting a fine. So, and that's how it started. We started building using that insurance money. It was the first Coptic church in Australia being built, as I said, as a result of a mishap or an accident. And as soon as we laid the slab or the floor, the concrete floor, Abuna wanted to move in and started praying. There was no walls, nothing. It was just a slab. And when it rained, the whole area and the street and the road and the access, it was all muddy. So people would sort of would put planks down. People would sort of cross from where they parked across to the street. But we had some turf down and some dirt, and until they get to the slab for the church. But once you get on the slab, you didn't want to go back and wade in the mud. So anyway, we started, and as soon as we started, so obviously we used all the money from the insurance. And that was Dad's idea, a very wise decision. He said, we'll start praying. So he started praying on the slab, and he would say, people, this is your church. We need bricks. We need steel frames. We need roof. We need windows. And every week money would be pouring in. So he didn't have to borrow anything. So it was built debt-free.
Purely on the donations of the
Purely
congregation.
on the donation, and that's where God's blessing, and I can see the hand of the Lord working with Father Mina, because let's say, for example, the bricks needed $20,000 to buy and to lay. They would collect in that week, honestly, $20,000. Not much more, nothing less.
No way.
We would say we would need to get the window frames, honestly. It happened 3 or 4 times. We need $8,000 for the steel frames for the windows, just to put the frames in as the brickwork is going up. You have to have the window frames. And $8,000 would be collected in that week.
As opposed to the 20 the previous week.
Yes. Whether it's a week or a month, we would say we need bricks, we need windows, we need the steel frame, because you need to put the whole design of the church. Actually, even now, it's the church with the biggest span. The way I designed it what's called portal frame. And the portal frame is a steel frame, so the span was about 18 meters. In most of the churches here or in Egypt, you'd find columns inside the church. This church doesn't have any columns. It was the widest span that was available for the portal frame that I designed for it. Yeah, and I think it was 6 sections. Each section is about 5 meters, so it was 17 or 18 meters wide by about 30 meters. Because each block had a 30-meter frontage. So I built it to take exactly 1 block of land in width. So the 2 rooms left and right for the ladies' room and the men's room. So it made it the shape of a cross. And the roof is a curved roof, and that was made out of iron or tin. So everything we needed in building, you have stages or steps. So God would arrange for the money, whether it's the slab, the walls, the windows, the frames, anything, the roof, so that the shell was complete within something like 3 months.
That's amazing.
Record time in preparing the plans and getting the approval. You can honestly see the hand of God working with that.
What a great story.
Yeah.
And tell us, just before we leave you, a very quick story about your attendance at the first funeral.
Yeah, well, because when we first came to Australia, there were no deacons. Father Mina and his family, he was the priest, and there was no, so myself, Ed, and my older brother Albert, we were the deacons. So we were there for all weddings, funerals, baptism, whatever that was required. And I remember the first funeral was for a Syrian or an Assyrian man who died on the building site, because the Syrian congregation, there was no other, the Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, they would come and they were part of our congregation, the Egyptian or the Copts, the Coptic Orthodox. So when they had a death in the community, they brought him to Dad's church. I've never seen a funeral or been in a funeral. Neither has any of my family. I suppose Mum and Dad have. But after we did the prayers in the church, he got into the hearse, got to the cemetery, and the Syrian people, there were half a dozen people, they insisted on carrying the coffin and putting him in the ground, because burial here, all burials here, you put them in the ground. Unlike Egypt, you take it into a room. So to put it in the ground was a 6-foot hole in the ground that was pre-dug. So the people were carrying it, and they wanted to jump in and saying, "Oh, look, lift this, do that, and hand it over." And they didn't know what they were doing. So the box slipped and fell into the ground nose first, and it was broken, and the body parts were coming out of everywhere out of the box. It was a terrible sight. My brothers and I had nightmares for weeks, just seeing arms and legs, because at the construction site it was a bad industrial accident.
Oh my
and his body wasn't whole. So arms and legs were coming out of the coffin when it sort of went to pieces, when it dropped into
And that was the first funeral held at Coptic Orthodox.
That was the first funeral in Australia, yes.
Oh my goodness.
In the Coptic church.
What a story. That is a story to pass down for many generations.
Yes. It's same with the first, anything to me, the first wedding, the first baptism, the first funeral. It's still out, still recall, still have memories. Yeah.
Tony, we thank you so much for your many stories, especially about the building.
Yes.
And thank you so much for taking us down that journey with you.
Memory lane.
And memory lane, for the past 50 years.
Yeah, thank you.
you.
Okay.